WFYI podcasts are brought to you by Visit Bloomington. With over 350 restaurants to choose from, Bloomington, Indiana is truly a food lover's paradise. Go to visitbloomington.com to discover what suits your taste.
This is WFYI News Now. It's February 13th, and I'm Abriana Herron. On today's show, the governor signs a bill that reduces protections for the state's wetlands. Indiana farmer John Rust's lawsuit heads to the state Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules on the case of the DNR officer making false statements. And an update on the BP Whiting Refinery story we've been following. A meeting was abruptly canceled last week when the high school hosting it locked its doors.
We need to do the trace and get to the bottom of this because this is undemocratic as hell.
Those stories coming up. But first, Indianapolis Mayor Joe Hogsett yesterday announced a new chief of police for the city's police department. Jill Sheridan has more.
When Chris Bailey was named interim chief of IMPD last month, he said he would not seek the job permanently. But he says he changed his mind during a recent road trip with the help of his teenage daughter.
I explained my reasons for declining the opportunity, and she, in her best Gen Z way, told me I was wrong.
Bailey is a 25-year veteran of IMPD and an Indianapolis native. He served as assistant chief for the past 4 years. In his interim role, Bailey was tasked to study priority areas. That included how to improve police recruiting and retention, the reduction of police-involved shootings, and changes to modernize the department. Bailey announced 2 new assistant chiefs, Catherine Cummings and Michael Woolley, as part of the modernization effort. I'm Jill Sheridan.
The governor signed a controversial bill yesterday that further reduces protections for the state's wetlands because of a law passed 3 years ago in the result of a recent U.S. Supreme Court case. Few wetlands in Indiana are protected today. The bill would lower the number of wetlands that could fall into Class 3, Indiana's most protected group of wetlands, and the only class that didn't lose significant protections when the state changed its wetlands law in 2021. Proponents say the bill strikes a good compromise between developers and the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. But environmental advocates and wetland experts say they weren't consulted on the bill and that it will lead to the loss of even more wetlands in Indiana. The House bill is the first to get signed by Governor Eric Holcomb this legislative session. Opponents say it was fast-tracked through the legislature. And whether Southern Indiana farmer John Rust will appear on the U.S. Senate Republican primary ballot this spring is now in the hands of the state Supreme Court. The court heard arguments yesterday on Rust's lawsuit challenging the state's ballot access law. There are 2 ways an Indiana candidate can run in a Republican or Democratic primary. Either they voted in that party's primary in the last 2 primary elections in which they cast a ballot, or they have to get the permission of the county party leader where they live. John Rust doesn't meet those requirements. He voted in the 2016 GOP primary but cast Democratic ballots before that, and his local party leader refuses to allow him access. An attorney for the state argued the ballot access law makes things clearer for voters by keeping ballots uncluttered and showing affiliation with a political party. Supreme Court Justice Christopher Goff sounded skeptical.
I'm really having a difficult time understanding how voter confusion is alleviated by precluding a choice between 2 candidates.
But Justice Mark Massa suggested political parties should get to choose who runs in their primaries.
I wanted to associate with the most popular girl in high school, but she had a say in it. Doesn't the party here have some say in who associates with it?
The court did not give a timetable for its ruling, but the deadline to finalize the ballot is within the next few weeks. Taxpayers are off the hook for damages and legal bills after a woman was arrested because of false statements made by an Indiana Department of Natural Resources officer. Brandon Smith reports that's what the state Supreme Court decided in a recent ruling.
Kaylee Leonard accidentally hit and killed the dog of DNR Officer Scott Johnson in front of his home. She left the scene and returned shortly after to tell Johnson what had happened. Months later, Officer Johnson told a local prosecutor Leonard hadn't returned until the next day. That led to her being charged with leaving the scene of an accident. Those charges were eventually dropped, and she then sued Johnson in federal civil court. Leonard won that case, with Johnson ordered to pay more than $60,000 in damages and costs. Indiana law allows state employees to pass on those costs to the government if the employee's actions were non-criminal. The state Supreme Court says they were. It says there's no evidence to show that Johnson knowingly lied, which would be the criminal act, and the court ruling means that the state is now responsible for paying Leonard and her attorney what they're owed. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Brandon Smith at the State House.
And for our final story today, Northwest Indiana residents say a meeting on BP's Whiting Refinery was abruptly canceled last week when the high school hosting it locked its doors. Rebecca Thiel reports state officials say the East Chicago High School decided not to host a meeting because it didn't want the press there.
The Whiting Refinery has had several serious maintenance issues within just the past few weeks. That includes 2 tank leaks and a power outage that released excess pollution and forced employees to evacuate. Longtime Whiting resident and environmental advocate Carolyn Marsh says when she and others attempted to go into the Indiana Department of Environmental Management meeting, the doors were locked, and at the time the meeting was to start, the lights in the building were turned off.
We need to do the trace and get to the bottom of this, because this is undemocratic as hell. We cannot tolerate being locked out of a public building in a public meeting that's about our health and safety.
The school city of East Chicago says members of the public tried to force their way in and that IDEM didn't provide adequate security for the meeting. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Rebecca Thiel.
IDEM rescheduled the meeting for next Thursday, the 22nd, at Calumet College of St. Joseph at 6 p.m. Central. That's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by the following people who live in your community: Darian Benson, Drew Dodlin, Kendall Antron, who composed the music for this podcast, and me, Abriana Herron. Our news director is Sarah Neal Estes. If you like today's episode, remember to subscribe and share, and follow WFYI on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.